My mother-in-law pinched my 2-year-old's arm and told her she needed discipline. My husband saw it happen. He didn't move. He didn't say a single word. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I picked up my daughter, looked Marilyn dead in the eye, and said exactly one word. Noted. Then I walked out the front door with my daughter on my hip and my husband still frozen at the dinner table, staring at his plate like it might tell him what to do. They thought that was the end of it. A dramatic exit. A wife overreacting to old-fashioned parenting. Something that would blow over by the weekend, the way everything always blew over in that family. They had no idea that noted wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the most carefully documented case of my life. And by the time I was finished, Marilyn wouldn't just lose access to my daughter. She'd lose the one thing she valued more than her own son's approval. My name is Bethany Cross. I'm 31, and for the last 6 years I've worked as a compliance auditor for a regional healthcare network. My entire job is finding the small inconsistency that unravels a much bigger story. I read financial statements the way other people read novels. I notice when a number doesn't match what someone claims it should be. It's a skill that pays my mortgage. I never imagined it would be the skill that protected my daughter. I married Tanner 4 years ago. He's kind, steady, and one of the most conflict-averse people I've ever known. I used to think that was sweet, a man who never raised his voice, never let arguments spiral, never made a room feel unsafe. What I didn't understand yet was that his calm wasn't peace. It was avoidance dressed up as patience. And avoidance always has a cost. Someone always ends up paying it. I just didn't know yet that the someone would be our daughter. Tanner's mother, Marilyn, had run the family since his father passed away when Tanner was 19. She didn't just raise Tanner. She financed him. College tuition, his first car, the down payment on the house we lived in before we bought our own place. All of it came from a family trust his father had set up years earlier, meant to benefit his children and eventually his grandchildren. Marilyn had appointed herself the trust's permanent administrator not long after the funeral, and nobody in the family had ever thought to question it. Why would they? She was generous. She showed up with casseroles and unsolicited advice and holiday gifts wrapped in ribbon, and everyone quietly accepted the exchange without naming it out loud, her money in return for her control over every decision that mattered. I noticed the control early, long before Adeline was born. Small things. She'd rearrange my kitchen cabinets to be more efficient while babysitting, and I'd come home to find every spice alphabetized in an order that made no sense to how I actually cooked. She'd correct how I dressed Adeline for the weather, even in the middle of July, insisting a baby always needs another layer. She'd tell me, in that syrupy tone some people mistake for warmth, that, in my day, we didn't coddle children so much. I let most of it go. You pick your battles when you're the daughter-in-law, and your husband won't pick any battles at all, ever, on anyone's behalf. Even at our wedding, Marilyn had insisted on approving the seating chart for Flo, which somehow meant her side of the family occupied every table closest to the head table while mine were pushed back near the kitchen doors. My own mother laughed it off at the time and said every family has one person like that, someone who needs the room arranged around them. I laughed along with her. I didn't yet understand that Marilyn wasn't simply particular. She was someone who had built an entire identity around being the person nobody in the family could function without, and she protected that identity the way other people protect a fortune. Tanner used to explain her behavior to me gently, in our early years together, the way you'd explain away a friend's bad habit. That's just how she is, he'd say. She means well. I believed him, mostly because I wanted our marriage to start on solid ground, and because I genuinely liked the version of Tanner who didn't want to fight with anyone. I didn't yet understand that "she means well" was a sentence he'd been repeating to himself since he was 19 and needed her financial support too badly to ever question it out loud. Adeline was 2 that spring. She was at the age where every meal felt like an adventure and every rule was more of a suggestion she was still testing. We were at Marilyn's house for one of our regular Sunday dinners, the kind we'd been doing every few weeks since Adeline was born, always at Marilyn's table, always on Marilyn's schedule. Adeline reached across the table for a dinner roll before we'd said grace. It was exactly the kind of thing 2-year-olds do. It wasn't defiance. It was hunger and curiosity and a complete absence of table manners, because she was 2 years old and had no concept of grace yet. Marilyn grabbed my daughter's arm and pinched the soft skin above her elbow, hard enough that Adeline immediately started crying. She needs discipline, Marilyn said, in the same tone she might have used to comment on the weather. I looked at Tanner. He looked at his plate. That silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt like 4 years. I stood, lifted Adeline out of her booster seat, checked her arm, already turning pink, a small crescent mark where fingernails had pressed into skin, and I said, "Noted." I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I put my daughter's coat on with hands that were shaking more than I let anyone see, and I drove home without waiting to find out whether Tanner would follow. He didn't follow that night. Here's what nobody in that dining room understood about me. I don't process conflict out loud. I process it on paper. That night, after Adeline was finally asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and did what I do at work whenever something doesn't add up. I started documenting. I took photos of the mark on Adeline's arm from 3 angles, each one time-stamped. The next morning I brought her in for a well check I'd already had scheduled weeks earlier, and I asked her pediatrician, Dr. Alvarez, almost as an afterthought, to note the bruise in her chart. She did, documenting the bruise and noting that it appeared consistent with a pinching injury. That single note would end up mattering more than I could have guessed sitting in that waiting room. Tanner came home 2 days later acting as though nothing significant had happened. He asked if I was still upset. I told him I wasn't upset. I was done being surprised by things I should have seen coming. He didn't understand what that meant yet. Honestly, neither did I, not fully. I only knew I wasn't going to keep absorbing these moments and calling it keeping the peace for the sake of the family. For the first time in our marriage, I called my closest friend from law school, Delia, who'd gone on to practice family law while I went into auditing. Over the years, Delia had heard pieces of my Maryland stories the way you hear about someone's difficult in-laws, with sympathy, but from a distance, filed away as harmless family friction. This time I gave her the whole picture. The rearranged cabinets, the endless parenting corrections, and now a documented mark on my daughter's arm, backed by a pediatrician's written note. Delia's first question surprised me. "Bethany, does Marilyn still control that family trust his father set up?" I said yes. She'd controlled it for over a decade, and nobody had ever asked to see the numbers. "Then I want you to sit with something," Delia said. "People who need to control everything rarely stop at just one area of their life. If she's careless enough to leave a mark on a toddler in front of witnesses, I'd bet real money she's been careless somewhere else too. Somewhere with paperwork behind it." She walked me through it the way she would with any client, laying out 2 separate tracks instead of one tangled mess. Track 1 was Adeline's physical safety, which needed a pediatrician's note, photographic evidence, and a clear written agreement about future contact. Track 2, she said, was optional, and she wanted me to think carefully before I opened it, because once you start pulling on a family's finances, you can't undo what you find. "You don't have to go looking," she told me. "But if part of you already suspects something's off, ignoring it won't make it not true. It just means she gets to keep doing it." I thought about the college fund Marilyn always mentions so vaguely at holidays, and the kitchen renovation she'd paid for in cash the year before, and the way she always changed the subject whenever Tanner's sister asked when the kids might actually see any of that trust money for themselves. I told Delia I wanted to look. That single decision changed the direction of everything that followed. Tanner, as a named beneficiary, technically had access to the trust's annual statements, something he'd never once bothered to actually read because Marilyn always summarized the numbers for him herself over the phone, in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. I asked him, carefully, without accusation in my voice, if I could look at the paperwork. He shrugged and said sure. He didn't see what difference it would make, but if it would make me feel better after everything. It did more than make me feel better. It gave me an actual case. I spent the next several weeks doing, after Adeline's bedtime, exactly what I do every day at work, finding the number that doesn't match the story wrapped around it. The trust had been established to cover education costs and general well-being expenses for Tanner, his sister, and eventually their children. Going back 4 years, I found repeated transfers out of the account labeled administrative expenses and trustee compensation that were nearly triple what similar family trusts typically allow, according to the trust's own founding paperwork, which specified a modest, fixed annual fee. Marilyn had been quietly paying herself far beyond what she was ever entitled to, funneling the difference into a personal account, all while telling Tanner and his sister the trust balance was simply running low whenever either of them asked about using it for their own kids' expenses. It wasn't a small discrepancy. Over 4 years, the irregularities added up to just under $90,000. Money that was supposed to secure Adeline's future, and the futures of Tanner's sister's 2 children, had been quietly redirected while Marilyn maintained the image of a generous, self-sacrificing matriarch who gave everything for this family. I brought all of it to Delia, along with the pediatrician's documented note. Delia laid it out plainly. On the parenting side, one documented incident on its own likely wasn't enough to force a permanent no-contact order, but paired with a clear, ongoing pattern of controlling behavior, it was more than enough to justify a formal request for supervised-only visitation going forward. On the financial side, the trust irregularities were a separate and far more serious matter, one that could result in Marilyn being formally removed as trustee and required to repay everything she'd taken. Before I acted on any of it, something happened that pushed me from cautious to certain. 2 weeks after the dinner incident, while Tanner and I were still deciding how to move forward carefully, Marilyn let herself into our house using the spare key we'd given her years earlier for emergencies. She showed up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working from home upstairs, took Adeline out to the backyard for some fresh air, and didn't mention it to me until I came downstairs 40 minutes later and found the back door open and my daughter gone from the living room where I'd left her playing. My heart stopped for the 10 seconds it took me to spot them through the kitchen window. Marilyn was crouched in front of Adeline in the grass, gripping her wrist, telling her firmly to stop that whining right now. Adeline was crying. There was no injury this time, but there didn't need to be. The message was clear. Marilyn had decided that noted meant nothing, that the boundary I'd drawn without a single raised voice was one she intended to walk straight through whenever it suited her. I didn't confront her in the yard. I went back upstairs, photographed the moment through the window with a timestamp, and waited until she left before I said anything to Tanner. That night, I changed the locks. I also told Tanner calmly that this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a decision, and I needed him to be part of making it instead of standing beside it. That same week, something else surfaced that I hadn't gone looking for. Delia, doing her own background work before the family meeting, reached out to Marilyn's former daughter-in-law, a woman named Priscilla who had briefly been married to Tanner's cousin years before Tanner and I ever met. Priscilla hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since her divorce, mostly by choice. When Delia explained why she was calling, Priscilla went quiet for a moment and then said she wasn't surprised at all. She described the same pattern almost exactly. Her own daughter, gripped too hard for spilling juice at a family barbecue years earlier. A trust fund for that side of the family that always seemed to run thinner than it should have. A husband who froze instead of stepping in, every single time. Priscilla had walked away from the entire family rather than fight it, and for years she'd assumed it was simply easier to disappear than to be believed. Hearing that confirmed something I'd already begun to suspect but hadn't wanted to say out loud, even to myself. This wasn't a single bad moment at one dinner table. It was a pattern Marilyn had been repeating across an entire generation of grandchildren, protected every time by the same quiet complicity from the people who loved her, and by nobody ever bothering to look closely enough at the numbers behind her generosity to notice what didn't add up. That was when I finally sat him down and laid out everything I'd gathered. The photos. The pediatrician's note. The backyard incident. The trust statements, annotated the same way I annotate every audit I've ever done professionally, with every irregular transfer highlighted in yellow. I watched my husband's face move through something I hadn't seen from him before. Not defensiveness. Recognition. The kind that arrives when someone finally lets themselves see a pattern they've spent years quietly avoiding. She's been telling me the trust was almost empty, he said quietly, staring at the highlighted pages. For Adeline's college fund. For my sister's kids too. She always said there just wasn't much left to give. There would have been plenty, I said, if she hadn't been taking 3 times what she was ever allowed to. Tanner didn't defend her. That surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened so far. He sat with it for a long moment, and then he said something I hadn't expected to hear from him, not after 4 years of watching him deflect every hard conversation about his mother. I've spent my whole life letting her handle things so I wouldn't have to deal with her directly. I think I let that happen with Adeline too, at that table. I froze because I've always frozen around her. That's on me, not just her. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest, and it was the first time in our marriage that Tanner had chosen to see his mother clearly instead of quietly managing around her for the sake of avoiding conflict. We called his sister next. She'd pulled her own 2 kids back from regular visits with Marilyn nearly 2 years earlier, quietly, without much explanation beyond telling the family she was a lot to handle. When I told her what I'd found buried in the trust records, she went silent for almost a full minute. Then she said, "I always wondered why there was never quite enough for the kids' summer camp, but somehow there was always enough for her kitchen renovation last year." With Tanner and his sister both finally on the same page, Delia helped us formalize everything, methodically, without any dramatic public confrontation, because documentation is what actually holds up over time, not spectacle. Delia filed a formal request with the trust's original overseeing attorney, the same one who had drafted it under Tanner's father years earlier, requesting an independent audit of every disbursement over the past 5 years, backed by the discrepancies I'd already laid out in detail. At the same time, on the parenting side, Delia helped us draft a written agreement, supported by the pediatrician's documented note and the time-stamped backyard photos, establishing that any future time between Marilyn and Adeline would be supervised, with both Tanner and me present without exception. We requested a family meeting to present both matters together. Marilyn arrived expecting, I think, an apology from us. An acknowledgement that she'd been too harsh, and a chance to move past it the way she'd moved past every friction point in this family for the last decade, simply by outlasting everyone else's discomfort until it faded. Instead, the trust's overseeing attorney was already waiting on a video call when she walked in. Delia sat beside me. Tanner sat beside me too, which was its own quiet victory after everything. His sister joined by phone from 3 states away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid the pediatrician's note on the table first, then the time-stamped photos from the backyard, then the trust statements with every irregular transfer highlighted, 4 years of numbers telling a story Marilyn had spent a decade making sure nobody looked at closely enough to actually read. Marilyn's face didn't crumble the way I'd imagined it might during the weeks I'd spent preparing for this moment. She got angry instead, the particular kind of anger that comes from someone who has never once had to explain herself and genuinely doesn't know how to start. She called it a misunderstanding. She called it disrespectful. She looked at Tanner and said, "After everything I have done for this family, this is what you bring into my house?" Tanner didn't flinch this time. "You put your hands on my daughter twice and told her she needed discipline. And for 4 years you told us there wasn't enough money for the kids' futures, while there was close to $90,000 that says otherwise. I'm done pretending I didn't see either one." Marilyn's eyes moved from the papers to Tanner's sister's name lighting up the phone screen on speaker, and for the first time in the meeting, I watched something in her posture actually falter. She turned to me and tried a different approach, softer, almost pleading. "Bethany, you have to understand, everything I did was to hold this family together. Someone has to make the hard decisions. You held it together by deciding for everyone else what they were allowed to know," I said. "That's not the same thing as holding a family together. That's just holding on to control and calling it love." The trust's overseeing attorney confirmed, calmly and without much room left for debate, that the discrepancies I'd found matched what an initial review of the account already showed, and that a full formal audit would proceed immediately. Under the terms of the original trust document, any trustee found to have exceeded authorized compensation could be removed and required to repay the difference in full. Marilyn was formally suspended as trustee that same week, pending the audit's completion, and a neutral, court-appointed trustee was installed in her place to manage what remained for Adeline and her cousins going forward. On the parenting side, Marilyn refused to sign the supervised visitation agreement at first, insisting she had nothing to apologize for and that a mother shouldn't need permission to be alone with her own grandchild. Without her signature, we simply didn't need her cooperation. Tanner and I made the decision ourselves, as Adeline's parents, that any future contact would happen only with both of us present, and that the spare key she'd once had would not be replaced. Marilyn was informed of the decision, not consulted on it. For the first time in this family's history, she was the one being told how things would go, instead of the one deciding it for everyone else. She didn't apologize. Not that week, not in the months that followed. She told mutual family members that I had turned her own son against her, that I was controlling, that I had exaggerated one small moment at the dinner table into something it was never meant to be. But the pediatrician's note existed regardless of what she told people at church or over the phone. The backyard photos existed regardless of her version of events. The trust audit confirmed the missing funds regardless of how she tried to explain them away. Documentation doesn't care about someone's version of events after the fact. It simply is what it is, time-stamped and unmovable. The audit, once completed months later, confirmed just over $94,000 in unauthorized withdrawals across 5 years, slightly more than my own initial estimate. Marilyn was required to repay the difference in structured monthly installments, monitored directly by the new trustee going forward. She remained, on paper, Tanner's mother, invited to holidays if she ever chose to show up differently. She never really did. She attended one Thanksgiving after everything had settled, sat stiffly through the meal, said almost nothing, and left early without offering to help clean up, the way she once always had, if only to stay in control of the kitchen. Priscilla reached out to Tanner's sister a few months later, cautiously, once word had spread quietly through the family that the trust had been audited and Marilyn removed. It was the first real conversation the two of them had had in nearly a decade. Neither of them got their years back, but both of them finally had something they hadn't had before, someone else who believed them without needing convincing. Adeline, 3 years old by the time all of this resolved, doesn't ask about her grandmother much anymore. Children remember safety far more clearly than they remember relatives who made them feel small. She calls Delia Aunt Delia now, mostly because Delia shows up to every birthday party with a wrapped gift and none of the commentary about how the party should have been organized differently. Tanner and I are in a different place now, one I genuinely didn't expect to reach after that dinner. He talks now instead of freezing. When his sister brings up something uncomfortable about their mother, he doesn't change the subject the way he used to for years. It took nearly losing his wife's trust completely to teach him that silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice, and it has a cost, even when it feels like the easier one in the moment it's happening. I think about that dinner table often. The 4 seconds of silence before I stood up. For a while I wondered if I'd overreacted, walking out over one word from a 2-year-old's grandmother. I don't wonder that anymore. That one moment simply showed me clearly what had already been happening quietly for years, hidden behind casseroles and holiday cards and a trust nobody thought to question. Sometimes the smallest injustice is the single thread that, once you finally pull it, unravels everything someone has spent a decade carefully hiding. Documentation doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Given enough time and enough attention to detail, it says everything that needs saying, and nobody can argue with a timestamp. So here's my question for you. If you were sitting at that table, and you watched someone hurt your child and dismiss it in the very same breath, would you have said something out loud in that moment, or would you have done exactly what I did, and let the paperwork speak for you instead? If this story hit home, you know what to do. Follow Sophie Revenge for a new story every single day, because the quiet ones are always the most dangerous.